want to talk about two closely related things. One, what is history? Two, what is the start of history? What are the earliest phases of history? History is the collection of data, the collection of evidence, and the formation of a narrative, a story, around that data. You might think of this like math. On a graph, you can have a series of dots, and then you create a best fit line. You connect the dots on an algebra equation, for example, and it forms a curve. What we're doing in history is we collect data, we collect evidence, and the more of it we collect, the more we can see a line beginning to form, a storyline, a narrative. That's what history is. When does history begin? What is the earliest phase of history? History begins with writing, written records. Anything prior to the appearance of writing is prehistory. Human history starts with human beings writing things down. Cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphics, those kinds of primitive writing systems are the beginning of history. Before that, it's paleontology, it's prehistory. Some of the vocabulary words we're going to use in a history class. Well, obviously the first one is history. History is a narrative, which means history is a story. Only it's a true story. It's a real story. It's facts. And so we make a narrative by linking facts together. We call it data points. We have bits of data, we have evidence, and we link the data points together to form history. Archeology, paleontology, prehistoric, the things that happened before history. So history begins with reading and writing. Before there was reading and writing, there was no history. There was prehistory, so things are prehistoric. Paleontology is the study of things that happened during prehistoric times. A lot of times it deals with fossils and other animals, but it also deals with human activity that was not written down when we discover tools and other artifacts that human beings made. Archeology, of course, is digging those things up, finding evidence from prehistoric times. But archaeology can also be used to find out about historic times, times that are recorded in history. So archaeology belongs both to history and to prehistory. Reading and writing, that is the turning point. There is no history before there's writing. This is cuneiform, one of the earliest forms of writing, and it's called cuneiform because the word cunea is sort of related to the word like cone or wedge, and you see it's very angular. This is another very early form of writing. This is the earliest form of the Hebrew language, and if you look at modern Hebrew, it's nothing like this. This is the ancient form of Hebrew, two of the earliest writing systems we see. Anthropology is the study of culture. All right, so culture is how people live together, the things they think, the things they believe, the things they learn. If we look at clothing over the centuries and in different places, different styles of clothing, different kinds of food, different sports, different kinds of tools when human beings are creating and making things. Different jobs, different professions, different ways that people do their work, different kind of work that needs to be done. Social customs, all right, to curtsy in certain societies at certain times. When you met someone who was important, a woman would curtsy and a man would bow. So a curtsy is a social custom. When we look at using words, we want to be very careful about how we define them. So, for example, history and prehistory are different types of words, different eras, so we must be very specific about those usages. The Fertile Crescent is going to be some of the earliest historical evidence we have, the earliest writing, the earliest written records that start history. History begins with writing, and the earliest records, the earliest writing you can find will be the earliest point in history, the beginning of history. Before that, it was prehistory. So the Fertile Crescent is one. There are other places on the earth, but the Fertile Crescent is one of the places on earth where we find the earliest written records. We also will find in the Fertile Crescent prehistory. There are things that happened there before writing began, and we will find evidence of that through archaeology. As we look at human life together, people live in communities, people live in groups, and we're going to see two aspects to that. On the left side, in sort of a green color, society, culture, civilization are the voluntary groupings of human beings, the activities they engage in voluntarily through common consent. The yellow on the right-hand side, government, tax, and regulation, those are things that are enforced, not always voluntary. We would like to think they're voluntary. Hopefully people agree, but in fact there are times and places, more than we wish, that governments, taxes, and regulations are enforced upon people. When we think critically about history, we are going to have to evaluate our culture, our tradition, our values, as well as others. So we're going to ask questions about them. We're going to look at different points of view as we see them in different societies, cultures, and civilizations, and ask which ones are better, which ones are worse. Okay, we're going to have to evaluate them. You may have heard some point in time that you look at other cultures and you say they're different but not better or worse. We're turning that around. We will say that other cultures, civilizations, societies, belief systems, values, political systems are not merely different, but we will ask, are they better or worse? Culture organizes society, and we can see that humans live in a community, and the community gets a structure through these various ways that culture organizes things. So all of these factors come together to create an organization. Human beings live in community, and they organize their community. How do we learn culture? Culture is always learned. It's not inherited. It's not in your DNA. It's not in your gene pool. It's not in your chromosomes. You learn it. And there's a variety of ways in which we learn culture, and we'll look at each of these. Each culture forms a basis of shared understanding. So any culture that you look at could be Chinese culture, could be German culture, could be Australian culture, it could be Brazilian culture, anywhere around the world. You see these things are shared, a language and symbols, okay, the way people communicate, the way they make records, religious concepts. And even when you have different religions in a single society, in the United States we have several different religions, there are still common concepts that link all of those religions. Values are common. What is a value? It's what you think is important. Okay, do you value fill in the blank? Sports, art, music, things that you value are important to you, and we see different cultures have different values. Art, of course, music, painting, poetry, sculptures, architecture, all of that falls under art. And political beliefs. Again, even in the United States, even in our culture, where we have very different political views, underneath it are actually some very same views, some very common views. So even the people who argue against each other in politics, they have the same beliefs. For example, in the United States, no matter which different political views you have, you believe that we should not have a hereditary monarchy, that we should not have hereditary kings and queens. That is a common shared political belief in our culture. When we look at religion, we see religion emerges at a certain point in history. Religion is not present from the very beginning of history. What we see before religion is a pre-religious phase. And before religion, there was myth. There were narratives created to explain things. That's what a myth is. People would make up a story. Why does the sun rise in the east? Why does the winter follow autumn and come before spring? All kinds of why questions. People made up stories. Those are called myths. The other aspect before religion was a belief in magic, the attempt to control nature. I can make it rain more. I can make it rain less. I can change the temperature, things like that. Magic is a human attempt to steer, to manipulate the course of natural processes. Once we move beyond those pre-religious phases, later in the development of civilizations, we see religion proper, something that's actually a real religion emerging. And the signpost, the distinctive marker of a religion as opposed to a pre-religious phase, a religion focuses on a relationship between the individual human being and a deity. Relationship between a human being and God. And it's not an attempt to control nature. It's not an attempt to get an explanation for why the sun rises in the east. Religion accepts mystery, meaning we don't have to have a myth to explain everything. Religion is more about a relationship. So in any society you see anywhere in the world, at some point in its development, you're going to see the change from a pre-religious phase to an actual religion. Paleontology is basically the study of old stuff. Paleo means old. So the study of old stuff, could be fossils, could be animals that are extinct. It can also be human activity, human artifacts, things that people built, if it comes from a prehistoric time. So paleontology is everything that happened before history. Hunter-gatherers were human beings largely during that prehistoric time. Hunting for animals and gathering means plant food, but nothing that they themselves planted. So they never planted anything. They just would walk around and pick the plants that grew wild. They were nomadic for the most part. They did not live in one single place, but they were on the move. They'd park here for a while and then park there for a while. Could be a few days, a few weeks, or a few months. Usually they would move when the food supply moved. Paleolithic, there's that paleo again. Paleolithic is what we call the Old Stone Age. And so Paleolithic was a time in the earliest development of tools and beginning to develop more sophisticated kinds of dwelling. You see the pictures there. Many of them were still at least partially nomadic, but they were developing more sophisticated technology, what they could do with stones, with leather. Agriculture developed as part of the transition from Paleolithic to Neolithic, from the Old Stone Age to the New Stone Age. Agriculture just means farming. Slash and burn farming was one of the earliest types. To farm, to plant crops and plants, you need to have a clear field, and the easiest way to clear the field is just to burn everything. Now, that might seem bad, but it's actually good, because when you do slash and burn farming, when you burn all of that stuff, the ashes becomes fertilizer, and then when you plant crops in that field, they grow quite well. Neolithic is the New Stone Age, and you can see here that they are not nomadic anymore. They're building pretty solid dwellings, not just tents, but actual houses that will be permanent. So moving away from nomadic lifestyles, moving away from the idea that you could be on the go and having a permanent place now, and more farming. You see also fishing here as well. So Neolithic was another advance towards further technology. How do we learn about these people from the Paleolithic and the Neolithic eras? Archeology, right? You dig stuff up. And you can learn about prehistoric times, times before history. You can learn about through archaeology, but there's also modern archaeology that will tell us not only about prehistoric times, but about historic times, right? History begins maybe around, just let's say 7,000, 8,000 years ago, give or take. Anything before that is prehistory. Anything after that is history. Archaeology can tell us about both. Artifacts, the things that human beings make. Artifacts are designed and constructed by human beings, and a lot of times it's what archaeologists dig up. Domestication was part of the revolution, the agricultural revolution, the Neolithic revolution. Animals that have been genetically modified. Now, we think of genetic modification as something very recent, but genetic modification goes back thousands of years, and you could breed animals carefully to create different types, different variations of cows, sheep, chickens, etc. After the Neolithic, after the New Stone Age, we are going to see a leap forward, the development of bronze. Bronze is an alloy. Alloy is a mixture of metals. So bronze is a mixture of copper and other metals, and it becomes more useful. It can be used to construct artworks, as you see here, but also tools. And so we get the Bronze Age. And now we have pretty sophisticated technology. We can build very specific tools for farming, very specific tools for working on wood. We can also make weapons. Civilization has come about. All right, so moving from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic to the Bronze Age, we're seeing civilized people. What does civilized mean? Civilized means that there are social structures and physical structures. So you see buildings, you see neighborhoods, you see walls, you see houses, you see temples for worship. Those are physical structures. You also see social structures. Some people are farmers, some people are soldiers. Families develop and go through generations. That's all part of civilization. Anthropology is the study of different civilizations, the study of different cultures, the study of different societies, and we see anthropology will help us explore history. Culture is that way of life that you learn by growing up. So it's not in your DNA, it's not inherited, it's not in your gene pool or your chromosomes, but you learn it. You're born and you grow up in a culture, and that way of life is what shapes you and holds the society, the community together. The earliest civilizations were city-states. What does that mean? It's a city, that's obvious, meaning it's also a state. It's its own country. It's a city that's not a part of a country. That city is its own country, and that's a city-state. Ur was one of the most important early city-states, and we're going to see for a lot of reasons why it was very important. There was a guy named Abraham that came from Ur, and he's going to change history. Ur is one of the earliest places to have reading and writing and to have it on a mass level, where not just one or two people knew how to read and write, but where reading and writing was being taught to children on a regular basis. Ur is in a region known as Sumer. Okay, so this area on the map here is called Sumer. Ur was a city-state, so it was its own country. Sumer in the early years was not a country, but it was just a region. It was the area around where these rivers went into the Persian Gulf. And what are these rivers? The Euphrates is the one that's a little more southwest. The Tigris is the one that's a little more northeast. And these two rivers together form what we call Mesopotamia, literally the land between the rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Both of them pour into the Persian Gulf. And that area is going to become a big home for early civilizations and early cultures. If you notice on this map too, the Fertile Crescent, the area in green, includes Mesopotamia, but then it goes down the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea and to the upper edge of Egypt. The Fertile Crescent, called fertile because crops could grow well there. There was always a lot to eat. You could grow wheat, you could grow barley, you could grow vegetables, and civilization grows best where there's food to eat. A ziggurat is a structure, a physical structure that was a type of early temple, and we're going to see that in some of these early city-states like Ur. They had ziggurats. The ziggurats were used for human sacrifice and animal sacrifice. So one of the things that happened in the very earliest phase of society was human sacrifice. Yes, it's gross, it's scary, it's horrifying, but they did it. We'll find out why later. Cuneiform, one of the early writing forms, and you see that word cunea, looks like it's related to cone. It means sort of wedge, and it's very angular. It was made by taking a sharp stick and pressing it into clay, and this was the early writing form. Artisans. So we talked about civilizations have social structures, and one of the social structures is around the work you do, and artisans are a special class of workers. They are very skilled workers. And we see artifacts coming from artisans, right? So skilled workers producing products. We see specialization, different types of work for different people. That's part of an advanced civilization. Everybody has their own niche. Institutions, ways of organizing people into groups, and the patterns by which those groups function is part of a civilization. Scribes, we're going to develop a special class of people who read and write on an ongoing basis. Very important because they kept the records, and the records were important because it was related to finances. Okay, so who had how many cows, and who had how many chickens, and who had how many barrels of wheat, and who had how many barrels of rice, etc., etc. So reading and writing began mainly as an economic thing. Later on, we read and write for many other purposes, but the early stages of reading and writing were for financial records. Bartering. Okay, we don't have cash in these early civilizations, so there's no coins, nothing that you buy and sell with. So you trade. So people will trade back and forth, and it's going to be a long time yet before cash, coins, currency is developed. Dynasties, meaning royal families, will rule the earliest civilizations. It's hereditary. And that's going to be a pattern that's going to dominate human history for a number of centuries before we can come up with a different form of government. So dynasty, that family that's going to hand the power down from one generation to the next. Myth, very important in the earliest societies. A myth is a narrative, a story designed to explain something. Okay, now we use that word myth a lot. Realize, however, in history there are both true and false myths. A myth doesn't have to be false. There are true myths. So we have to go through myths and sort out why are they true or why are they false. But the point of a myth is that it will explain something to you, like why does the sun rise in the east and not the west? Or why does winter come after autumn and before spring? Myths were stories designed to explain. Early civilizations also dealt with magic, manipulation, superstition. Again, these were attempts to control nature, and that's why there were things like sacrifices. They were very concerned that they would be able to have enough food to eat. So to get good food, you had to have good weather. Not too much rain, not too little rain, just the right amount of rain. And they thought that if they sacrificed something to an imaginary idol, an imaginary god, that the god would control the weather for them. So they might sacrifice animals, and if they were really worried about the weather, they might even sacrifice a human being. So magic and manipulation, attempting to control nature. And human sacrifice is part of the earliest civilizations everywhere, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, in South America, North America, all around the world. Earliest civilizations engaged in human sacrifice. It's bloody, it's ugly, it's scary, but that's the truth. The earliest civilizations were also polytheistic. They believed in a whole number of gods, not just one, but many. These religions were fertility religions. We talked about that already. They were concerned about making crops grow, concerned about making sure there was enough food for everybody. So they wanted the fertility of the land, the farmland. Polygamy was common in many of these, having more than one spouse, a man with a number of wives. So these are all features of these early civilizations. Now history, again, history is a narrative that we assemble by gathering data, by gathering evidence, and lining it up. History shows us that we move away from polygamy, we move away from polytheism, we move away from magic, we move away from myth. So we're going to see progress, and as we get past the earliest stages of civilization, we are moving past this pre-religious phase. Okay, and what are we going to move toward? The idea of religion as a relationship. So no longer are people asking their religions to control nature. We're no longer asking religion to explain things like why does the sun rise in the east, but rather religion is a relationship between the individual human being and the deity, a relationship between the individual and God. So this is the more advanced version of belief once we get past the early stages of civilization. When we talk about culture, it's important to remember that culture is learned. You are not born with a culture, you are born into a culture. What does that mean? It means it's not in your DNA, it's not in your gene pool, it's not in your chromosomes. You learn it as a small child. You see things, you hear things, you observe a way of life. The people around you live a certain way, that's their culture. And as you grow up in that culture, it becomes your culture. So race, physical, biological markers, skin color, hair color, facial features, those kinds of things. Race has nothing to do with culture. They are separate. Race is genetic, biological, physical, immutable. Culture, we absorb. You can study it in books. You can just hear it in their parents, your neighbors, your brothers and sisters, your friends. You learn how to live the life the way people around you live, and that's culture.